65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce, sold to mothers for teething infants. A newspaper editor's office somewhere in America, around 1900. The desk holds a stack of advertising contracts, each one negotiated by hand. One of them has a clause printed in red ink. The words are simple. They matter. They say the contract becomes void. All revenue stops immediately if any hostile legislation passes against patent medicines, or if the paper itself runs any coverage suggesting the products are harmful. Something about that clause ended a silence that had lasted years. It was not hidden. It was printed in red. What was in that contract that made it worth more than the truth? And why did thousands of editors sign it anyway? If you enjoy these stories, support the channel by subscribing and liking. Now back to the story. In 1905, Americans spent approximately $75 million annually on patent medicines. No prescription required. No oversight. A mother could walk into any general store or receive a mail-order catalog and buy anything. The products were everywhere. They were on the shelf next to flour. They were advertised in every newspaper that needed the revenue to survive. The industry was organized. In 1881, the Proprietary Association of America was founded. It was a trade group with a specific purpose: to coordinate the marketing in defense of proprietary drugs, the patent medicines that made up the largest, most profitable segment of the American pharmaceutical market. By the turn of the century, the association had grown into a genuine industrial force. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup had been marketed since 1845, first from Bangor, Maine. And the formula was straightforward: 65 milligrams of morphine sulfate per fluid ounce, plus alcohol. 1 teaspoon contained the morphine equivalent of 20 drops of laudanum, enough to kill the average child. Mothers bought it by the bottle. Here's the part I could not get past. It was not a secret formula. The content was on the label. The word morphine appeared. Mothers read it. They bought it anyway, because it worked. The children stopped crying. Then some children stopped waking up. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was marketed directly to women. It was advertised as a cure for female complaints. Vague language for vague pain. The formula contained 20% alcohol. The Proprietary Association members knew this. They knew what they were selling. The advertisements did not mention the alcohol content. The bottles did not emphasize it. A woman taking Lydia Pinkham's was taking a product that was, by volume, 1/5 whiskey, marketed with the implicit suggestion that it was medicine. Later, before the 1906 Act required labeling, the alcohol percentage was reduced to 15%. Sales remained robust. During the temperance era, many American women had pledged against alcohol and would not have touched whiskey directly. Yet they purchased Lydia Pinkham's 1/5 whiskey without contradiction. The advertisements employed testimonials from women who framed the compound as medicine rooted in maternal care and religious virtue, using language borrowed from religious testimonies. Women described themselves as restored, renewed, given back to their families. The 20% alcohol was the active pharmacological ingredient. Yet it did not register as alcohol because the container was labeled medicine and surrounded with language about virtue and redemption. Coca-Cola originally contained cocaine. This is documented and well known. Bayer marketed heroin commercially as a cough syrup beginning in 1898. The company did not hide the ingredient. They marketed it as superior to morphine because it was less habit-forming. This claim was false. Bayer sold it anyway. The $75 million figure, mentioned at the outset, requires context to make sense. In 1905, that sum was equivalent to roughly $2.4 billion in contemporary money. The American pharmaceutical industry as a whole was smaller. Patent medicines, the unregulated, largely unexamined segment, represented a larger proportion of total healthcare spending than prescription pharmaceuticals do in the modern era. The sheer scale of the market had consequences. By the turn of the century, the industry had grown expansive. Approximately 50,000 distinct patent medicines had been registered across the United States. 50,000 separate products, each with its own formula, its own marketing strategy, its own distribution network. The number alone suggests something important. This was not a fringe enterprise. It was the dominant structure of American medicine. The Proprietary Association coordinated the marketing for all of these products. They held meetings. They set strategy. They discussed industry challenges. And at some point, one of them, a man named F.J. Cheney, proprietor of Hall's Qatar Cure, came to a meeting with an idea. Now look at this carefully, because the details matter. Cheney presented a new clause for use in advertising contracts. The clause was printed in red ink. It stated that the contract would become void in the event of hostile legislation against patent medicines, or in the event that the newspaper or magazine ran any coverage suggesting the products were harmful or ineffective. Cheney described it as a way to make the press do his fighting. He described it as a club, a way to hold leverage over legislators and editors alike. The assemblage received the idea well. So emphatically did the device recommend itself to them that the red clause, as it became known, spread rapidly through the industry. Large firms took it up. Smaller ones followed. Within a few years, the red clause had become a standard term in advertising contracts across the patent medicine business. It appeared on the contracts that newspapers and magazines signed with patent medicine companies, the contracts that came across the desk of every editor in America. The financial incentive was enormous. Patent medicine was 26% of NWA's total advertising revenue in 1878. By 1900, it had dropped to 15%, still a substantial portion of the agency's annual income. For newspapers and magazines, the proportion was often higher. In the decades following the Civil War, newspapers were described as being mainly supported by the patent medicine industry. For a struggling paper in a small city, the revenue from patent medicine contracts could mean the difference between survival and closure. An editor facing a stack of contracts with a red clause in red ink was facing a choice that was not really a choice. He could sign the contracts and keep the paper alive, or he could refuse and watch the revenue disappear. He could print the truth about what was in the bottles, or he could print nothing and keep his staff employed. Harvey Washington Wiley, the chief chemist of the USDA, was running chemical analyses on food and drugs throughout the 1880s and 1890s. His laboratory, which came to be known as the Poison Squad, because Wiley himself conducted tests on volunteers to measure the effects of food additives, had the data. The analyses existed. The knowledge existed. But the knowledge did not appear in the newspapers, and the red clause was the reason why. If the medicines were safe, there was no need for a clause that voided the contract the moment anyone said they were harmful. In 1905, Samuel Hopkins Adams was assigned by Collier's Weekly to investigate the patent medicine business. He was a reporter, not a crusader. He had worked for the New York Sun. He was following a story. He followed it further than felt comfortable. Adams requested copies of advertising contracts from newspapers across the country. He wrote to editors in multiple states, in different cities, serving different readerships. What he found was precise. The same red clause appeared identically reproduced on contracts from New York to California. The wording was not substantially similar. It was word for word identical. The clause was not an accident of one company's legal department. It was not a coincidence. The clause was a coordinated industry standard, distributed and enforced across the entire patent medicine business. Every major newspaper he contacted had signed a version of it. The editor's position, once made visible in the contracts themselves, was impossible in a way that required no accusation. The editor knew what the red clause said. He knew his readers were buying these products. He knew that Wiley's analyses existed. The USDA had made them available. He had, in some cases, personally read reports about what was actually inside the bottles. This was not a situation in which ignorance and knowledge were divided. The choice was not between not knowing and knowing. The choice was between knowledge and revenue. The choice was between acknowledging what he understood to be true and maintaining the revenue stream on which the paper depended. The choice was between being the kind of editor who printed what he knew and the kind of editor who kept his staff employed. Adams was 34 years old. He read the contracts. He read the meeting minutes of the Proprietary Association. He attended industry conventions. He collected the advertisements and the product labels and the chemical analyses that existed in Wiley's files. And then he began to write. The article started on October 7th, 1905. Adams called the series The Great American Fraud. In those articles, he reprinted the actual language of the red clause. He named the products. He named the proprietary association. He described the meetings where the clause had been unveiled and approved. He laid out the whole system, piece by piece, for readers who had never known it existed. Wait, read that again. The proprietary association had written it down. They had recorded in their own meeting minutes that the purpose of the red clause was to control press coverage. This was not an inference. This was not a theory or a guess. The industry's own organization had documented in their own words that they had designed a mechanism to suppress editorial coverage of their products. They had recorded it. The minutes were preserved. Adams had read them. And now the country was reading Adams. The proprietary association did not withdraw. Instead, they lobbied. Representatives sent testimony to congressional hearings on the proposed Pure Food and Drug Act, but testifying that labeling requirements would harm small businesses and destroy the economic foundation of the industry. They argued formulas were proprietary trade secrets. They did not argue that products were safe. The argument was that safety was not the relevant question. Disclosure, they testified, would confuse consumers. They defended the architecture of secrecy. The proprietary association lobbied against the labeling requirements of the proposed Pure Food and Drug Act, not against the act itself, but specifically against the requirement to disclose what was inside the bottles. They wanted to prevent the disclosure of drug contents. They failed. The act passed in 1906. After June of that year, any product containing alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, heroin, eucaine, chloroform, cannabis indica, chloral hydrate, or acetanilide had to say so on the label. But the passage of the law did not answer the central question. The law said the bottles had to be labeled. It said nothing about the years before 1906, when the Red Clause had kept the truth out of every major newspaper in America. I want to stop here for a moment. The timing could be coincidental. Institutional self-interest is not the same as coordinated suppression. Newspapers needed revenue to operate. A paper that refused to run patent medicine advertising might not survive. The editors who signed the contracts were not villains. They were people who had a choice, and they chose to stay in business. That is not an accusation. That is how systems work when no one is watching them work. But the Red Clause existed. It was designed. It was implemented. It spread across the entire industry. And for years, measurable years, countable in dollars, and in readers who never knew, it kept the truth about what was in the bottles out of the press. The mothers who gave their children Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup received no warning from their newspapers. The women who took Lydia Pinkham's through pregnancies did not know they were drinking alcohol marketed as medicine. The people who became dependent had no way to know. The 1906 Act gave them labels but did not restore the past. After 1906, the industry adapted. Products reformulated. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound dropped from 20% alcohol to 15%. When the label had to say so, sales dropped. Mrs. Winslow's reformulated, reduced the morphine content, but continued to be sold. It remained on the British market, where labeling requirements were not as strict as until 1930. The industry learned to work within the new regulatory framework. The Red Clause became harder to use openly. The specific language of the contracts changed. Publishers had gained political cover from the 1906 Act. They could now report on harmful medicines without technically violating the Red Clause, because the Act itself was no longer hostile legislation. It was the law. Hall's catarrh cure, Lydia Pinkham's, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, the patent medicines accumulated on pharmacy shelves. The proprietary association coordinated their marketing. The advertising agencies collected their percentages. The newspapers signed the contracts with the Red Clause printed in red. What they all shared was the same revenue stream, dependent on a public that did not know what was in the bottles. Here's what I kept coming back to. The Red Clause survives in documented form. Samuel Adams reprinted the actual language in Collier's Weekly. The proprietary association preserved their own meeting minutes. Harvey Wiley's chemical analyses are in the public record. The AMA ran its own analyses. The morphine content of Mrs. Winslow's 65 milligrams per fluid ounce is documented. The dates are documented. The names are documented. What is notable is what did not happen. No major American newspaper ran a sustained investigative piece on the Red Clause while it was in effect. Not one. Not because no one knew. The knowledge existed. Harvey Wiley's office had been running analyses since the 1880s. The analyses were there. The data was there. It simply did not appear in the papers. If the old system was suppressing nothing, why did the mechanism for suppression need to exist at all? After 1906, the memory of the mechanism faded. The proprietary association changed its name and public posture. The red clause became harder to use openly. The specific language disappeared from contracts. The knowledge of what had happened, not the general fact that patent medicines had been problematic, but the specific, documented mechanism by which editorial silence had been purchased and maintained, became a footnote. Adams's series was remembered mainly for its contribution to the 1906 Act. The red clause itself, the physical object on the contract, the words in red ink that made editorial truth a violation of contract law, sank into obscurity. No major historical survey of American press freedom published before the 1960s mentioned the red clause as a structural constraint on editorial independence. Harvey Wiley himself was pushed out of the USDA in 1912. The food and drug industries he had spent decades opposing had lobbied against his budget, challenged his authority, and supported the appointment of a review board that overruled his decisions. He resigned. He spent the remainder of his career writing for Good Housekeeping. The man who had run the chemical analyses, who had documented what was in the bottles, who had made the 1906 Act possible. He was gone from government within 6 years of its passage. The institutional memory of who had actually fought for regulation, who had provided the evidence, who had understood the system from the inside, departed with him. It simply disappeared from the story. The narrative became simpler. The press had exposed a problem. The government had regulated the problem. The problem was solved. The part about the mechanism that had kept the press from telling the story in the first place was not part of the official history. The editor's office, the stack of contracts, the clause in red ink. Now you know what it was. Now you know what it meant. Now you know why it existed. If the medicines were safe, why did the contract become void the moment anyone said so? If the press was free, why did the same clause appear simultaneously in thousands of advertising contracts across the country? If the proprietary association was only a trade group, why did their own meeting minutes describe the red clause as a tool for controlling what newspapers could print? If the 1906 Act was the solution, why did Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, still containing morphine, remain on the British market until 1930? If you had been that editor in 1900, reading the clause printed in red on the contract in front of you, knowing what your paper needed that revenue to survive, what would you have printed? The silence was not accidental.